joining us. I've never known you not to be blunt. What's your assessment of the situation, how COVID's affecting the industry?
Significant. If the prospect of Brexit wasn't bad enough and concerning enough, then the impact of COVID, I think, has done two things. Firstly, it's demonstrated not only the economic importance of tourism to the whole of local, regional, and national economies, but it's also shown us that people have only a certain grasp of how vulnerable the tourism industry is. So in my attractions, for example, they've all been closed since lockdown, obviously. The vast majority of them are wholly dependent on ticket revenue. So they haven't had any money coming in and won't until lockdown is released. And very few of them have significant reserves. So there are some of the most important visitor attractions, not only in the UK, but in the world, which have a question mark over their financial sustainability.
Can you remind us the sorts of attractions you're talking about when you mention those?
Yes, so I represent all of the largest visitor attractions in the UK, from the National Trust and English Heritage through to palaces, historic royal palaces, Buckingham Palace, zoos, theme parks, historic houses, stately homes, but also places like the Forestry Commission, Historic Environment Scotland, Titanic Belfast, through to Harry Potter.
So we were just talking about the the potential impact of the lack of visitors from overseas. I think I've heard you in the past in a speech give a statistic about the numbers of visitors that go to the big three museums on Exhibition Road. Can you remind the committee just how many visitors from overseas and obviously from the UK as well go to those attractions?
Yes, I mean, in normal times, and we will have them again, there'll be a new normal, but in normal times, the UK isn't just good at tourism, we're globally good. So 2 years ago, for example, more visitors went to the V&A, the Science Museum and the Natural History Museum combined than went to Venice. And 2 years ago, more people went to the British Museum than the whole of Belgium. And 2 years ago, more people went to the National Theatre, the South Bank Centre and the Royal Festival Hall than to the whole of Hong Kong. So we're good at this. And therefore, it shines the light on the vulnerability that we're currently feeling, because our international market, as Patricia was saying earlier, it looks like it's largely stopped for the rest of this year. And for those visitor attractions who are almost entirely dependent on inbound tourists as opposed to domestic ones, that's extraordinarily concerning.
Yes, and I mean, those are incredible stats, as you say. The big three museums attracting more visitors than Venice is quite astonishing. And you said, there'll be a new normal. I would ban that phrase. I want to know what the new abnormal is going to be like, because it's not normal. And Michael O'Leary has described the government's proposal for a quarantine of overseas visitors as idiotic and unimplementable. What's your assessment of what the government said on that so far, and what do you think is likely to happen?
Well, Michael O'Leary has a colourful turn of phrase. But I think what it actually means for us is that 90% of all inbound leisure visitors to the UK in any normal year stay for less than 2 weeks. So imposing a 14-day quarantine effectively removes 90% of the inbound market to the UK for the foreseeable future. As Patricia was saying earlier, that's also compounded by where we would normally expect recovery to come from. And the two markets who would usually come back to the UK most quickly after an event like this, after terrorism or whatever, tend to be the United States, our biggest economic market, and China. And all this sentiment research indicates that the United States people in the United States, this feels like an odd fact, but it's supported by data. People in the United States don't tend to travel internationally in a presidential election year. So if we were expecting the United States to come back in September, October, November, I'm not sure that they're likely. We would also expect China to come back too, but there is really good evidence that the Chinese people, A, are being encouraged to spend their holidays domestically within China. But also there's some sentiment research which shows that the Chinese people are less than impressed with the UK government's handling of COVID. And therefore, I think we've got some catching up to do in terms of brand reputation in China in the future.
Yes, I sense they may have been heavily influenced by the Chinese government there in their opinion of that, but they may have also valid points, obviously. Can I just ask you about the survival of a lot of the attractions that are in your membership, and what do you think is necessary from government to help those attractions to, some of which obviously, as you described, are going to have to go through a period of hibernation effectively in terms of being able to reopen or accept visitors in any numbers. What would be your policy ask of government? I've proposed there should be some kind of cultural asset or cultural attraction saving trust, you could call it CAST, which would be a sort of trust fund which the government would endow to enable these organizations just to survive this period and then be able to reopen in the future. And I'm thinking about things like the Wales Millennium Centre in my own constituency in Cardiff, or the St Fagans Museum of Welsh Life, which won the UK Museum of the Year last year. Organising. What would be your big policy ask of government for attractions?
I think you're absolutely right. One of the things that I think will become more important post-COVID is the UK has been putting a great deal of effort and investment into cultural diplomacy and our cultural assets. What we have to do, therefore, is to ensure that those cultural assets survive this. And that means that for some of our most iconic visitor attractions, giving them special financial support so that they survive. So, for example, the Royal Albert Hall, historic royal palaces, which includes the Tower of London, Banqueting House, Kensington Palace, Hampton Court Palace, the Old Vic, the Royal Academy, the Mary Rose, none of those receive any form of government funding, either from the state or from the Arts Council. So they're incredibly vulnerable and are running short on reserves. Now, it's unthinkable for the UK to have a strong, assertive, confident cultural diplomacy policy without some of those jewels in the crown still existing. So we have three particular asks of government, and I should caveat this by saying I echo Patricia's points entirely. We found DCMS, civil servants and ministers to be not only listening and helpful and cooperative and assertive in their advocacy for us with Treasury, but working so collaboratively to an extent that I haven't seen before. And I've been now appearing in front of this committee since 1997, so I've got a track record on this. The three asks are, we would like those visitor attractions which are owned and managed and run by local authorities to be similarly exempt from business rates. So if you're Bath and North East Somerset Council, for example, and you own and run the Roman Baths and the Victoria Art Gallery, their business rates are £900,000. And actually, local authorities should be as exempt for those business rates for their visitor attractions as any other part of the business. The second is that tourism arguably was hit first, hit hardest, and will probably be the part of the economy which will take the longest to recover. And therefore, whilst we're extraordinarily appreciative of the Chancellor's extension of furloughing beyond June to October, it may well be that for some visitor attractions and part of the tourism economy, they require that furloughing even to the end of this calendar year. And that's because for some visitor attractions, it is not economically viable to open in order to safely adhere to social distancing measures. If you're opening at 15 or 30% capacity, actually, you're not making any money. And therefore, the margins are too short. And then the last is to consider creative ways to support those attractions which don't get any government support at all. So places like farm attractions or science centres across the UK, small, important, fantastic attractions, but who are not reliant on grants from either local authorities or central government.
Okay. Thank you, Bernard. And I'm glad that the department's being, I think you said, are listening, being helpful and cooperative. We just need to see if they're effective, and in their discussions with the Treasury. But thank you for your evidence this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Steve Bryan.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much for joining us this morning. Could I just pick you up on the Science Centre's point? I declare my interest here as obviously I represent Winchester in Hampshire, which has the Winchester Science Centre, formerly